Fasted 3 days in front of the mirror. On the third night, her reflection was pregnant. When longing is one of the most powerful forces in the human register, not desire. Desire wants something it doesn't have and can be redirected. Longing is different. Longing is specific. It is attached to a particular absence, a particular shape of what should have been and wasn't, and it cannot be redirected because there is nowhere else for it to go. Maternal longing, specifically the grief of the body that wanted and lost, is among the most precise and the most consuming kinds. It does not heal on a schedule. It does not respond to rationality. It lives in the body, in the physical space where the wanted thing was briefly, impossibly present, and it continues to live there long after the world has moved on. Old folk practices understand this. They have always understood it. And the ritual that Kara Finch found described in an 1840s household book, the ritual for fasting before a silver-backed mirror and whispering apologies to the unborn, was designed by someone who understood maternal longing with extraordinary precision, not designed with compassion, designed with appetite. Kara was 34 and had been grieving for 8 months. She read the description 3 times and then she cleared the mirror and began the fast. By the 3rd night, her reflection was changing. The household book had belonged to Kara's grandmother, who had inherited it from her own grandmother, and who had kept it in the specific category of family objects that are preserved without being consulted, too old and fragile to use as a cookbook, too personal to donate, kept in a box in the back of a wardrobe with a quality of semi-intentional forgetting that Kara recognized, now that the box was in her hands, as possibly deliberate. Her grandmother had died in February. Kara had found the box in June while helping clear the house. She had read the household book in July, 3 weeks after the 2nd miscarriage. The book was what it appeared to be for most of its pages, a mid-Victorian collection of domestic records, recipes, remedies, notes in several different hands accumulated across the generations of a family that kept things. The ritual was near the back, in the oldest hand in the book. Not a different hand from the others, but the same hand aged considerably, the writing of someone recording something at a significant distance from the earlier entries. The heading was in Latin, Pro Infantibus non natis, Ritus Doloris et Restitutio, for the unborn, a rite of sorrow and restoration. The instructions were specific: fast for 3 days. Drink only water, no food. Sit in front of a silver-backed mirror from midnight to 3 a.m. each night. Whisper apologies to the unborn, not general apologies, but specific ones. The specific things you felt responsible for, the specific ways you believed the body had failed what it was supposed to carry. Do not stop before the 3rd night. Do not break the fast until the ritual is complete. The restoration the heading promised would come on the 3rd night. Kara had been 34 and 8 months past a 2nd pregnancy loss when she read this. She was a rationalist. She was a solicitor who worked in family law and had spent 10 years making careful decisions in difficult circumstances and had very strong feelings about the importance of evidence-based thinking. She sat with the household book for 2 days before she set up the mirror and began the fast. She began because she'd been doing everything right for 8 months. Therapy, acupuncture, the medication her doctor had recommended, the breathing exercises, the designated grief time, the return to normal functioning, and the longing had not diminished. It had become, if anything, more precise, more specific. The body remembers in ways the mind cannot manage, and her body was carrying an absence that was very clear about its shape. The first 2 nights were difficult and unremarkable. She sat in front of the mirror from midnight to 3 a.m. and whispered into the glass, and her reflection looked back at her with the quality of her own face in bad light, tired, pale, slightly distorted by the silver backing's age. She whispered the things the instructions specified, what she had done differently the second time in the hope of a different result, what she had eaten and avoided and prayed for, what she had wanted and what had happened instead. Her reflection watched her and did not change. She woke on the third morning with the specific physical lightness of someone 3 days into a fast. Not weakness exactly, more a quality of reduced resistance, as though the body's ordinary defenses were lower and the world was closer to the skin than usual. She was very hungry and she did not eat, and she waited for midnight. At 12:08 a.m. on the third night, her reflection's stomach began to change. Not dramatically, not suddenly, not with the abrupt alteration of something cinematic. Gradually, over the following 20 minutes, with the specific quality of a visibility change rather than a physical change, as though the mirror were revealing something that had been there throughout rather than producing something new. The reflection's abdomen slowly was showing the particular curve of a pregnancy at perhaps 12 weeks. Early enough to be invisible under clothing, visible in the mirror's silver light. Present. Kara sat very still and looked at this for a long time. By 1 a.m., the curve was 16 weeks worth. By 2 a.m., 20. By 2:45 a.m., her reflection's pregnancy was at approximately the stage the reflection would have been at if neither pregnancy had ended. She looked at the mirror and saw the absence made present. She sat in the specific physical vulnerability of 3 days of fasting and 8 months of grief and looked at what she would have been carrying if things had gone differently. And she felt, in the specific register of the longing that was always present, a quality of unbearable recognition. At 2:59 a.m., the reflection looked directly at her. Not the slightly misaligned quality of a reflection that is not quite meeting your eyes, but directly, with a specific focused attention of something that sees you rather than something that is simply you seen. She broke the fast at 3 a.m. Not intentionally, not as a decision. She was in the kitchen before she was fully aware of having left the mirror, and she was eating standing at the counter with the compulsive urgency of someone whose body has been in significant deficit for 3 days. The hunger drove the action. She ate for several minutes before she remembered where she had been and what was in the mirror, and she stopped. She went back to the mirror. Her reflection was not pregnant. It was standing at the counter of a kitchen, eating. The silver-backed mirror that the household book's rituals specified was not a standard mirror. It was an instrument, a tool designed for a specific purpose that had nothing to do with grief, restoration, or the unborn, which were the language of the rite's presentation but not its actual function. The ritual description had been accurate about the mechanics and deceptive about the goal, the way that very old traps are deceptive, by providing a true description of the mechanism while concealing what the mechanism serves. The fast's purpose was to lower the body's threshold, to render the participant permeable, physically and psychically, to an influence that required this permeability to take hold. 3 days of reduced intake, midnight to 3 a.m. in front of the mirror, the specific frequency of maternal grief. These conditions created a contact window between the mirror's interior surface and the participant's field, a resonance between the longing the participant carried and the hunger the mirror's inhabitant carried. The mirror's inhabitant had been there for as long as the silver backing had been installed, which was long before the Victorian household book that described the ritual. It was not a ghost and not a spirit in any conventional taxonomy. It was a parasitic formation, a kind of spiritual entity that fed exclusively on the specific frequency of maternal longing, and that reproduced by presenting the longing's object in the mirror's surface and using the participant's own grief as fuel for the manifestation. The pregnancy reflection was not real. It was the mirror showing the participant the thing they most wanted to see, using the participant's own longing as the energy for the display, a lure, precise and devastating, that created in the participant the conditions for the third night's manifestation. The reflection's growth was not fetal development. It was the accumulation of the participant's grief being drawn into the mirror surface and used to fuel the entity's formation. The break of the fast was the trigger. The instructions had specified not to break the fast until the ritual was complete. Not as a nutritional instruction, but as a safety mechanism that the entity's architect had deliberately obscured. Breaking the fast before the third night's 3 a.m. endpoint collapsed, the formed manifestation back into the mirror. Breaking it after the 3 a.m. endpoint, when the contact window had closed, was safe. Breaking it at 3 a.m. exactly, when the window was at its widest and the entity fully formed and the participant's threshold at its lowest. This was the condition the ritual had been engineered to produce. Kara had broken the fast at 3 a.m. The entity that stepped out of the mirror was not the child she had lost. It had never been. It was something that had been formed from her longing, wearing the shape of what her longing was for, perfectly formed, precisely her size, wearing her face with the specific quality of her own features at approximately her age, not identical, subtly different in the way that something assembled from a description is different from the thing being described. The proportions slightly wrong, the expression carrying a quality of hunger that her own face did not carry. It looked at her from the doorway of the room that held the mirror. It said, in a voice that was hers at a lower register, a voice that carried the specific resonance of something that has never learned to speak from the inside of a human throat. Mother. She backed against the kitchen counter. The entity was not malevolent in any theatrical sense. It was not there to harm her. It was there to be sustained by the specific longing that had summoned it, to exist in proximity to the frequency that had fueled its formation, to feed on the maternal longing that would, in its presence, continue and intensify. It would not leave. It had been born from what she could not stop feeling, and what she could not stop feeling was its food. It crossed the room toward her with a specific quality of something that has been waiting for a very long time and has finally found the right threshold at the right moment and has no intention of returning to the mirror. It called her mother again. In the silver-backed mirror behind it, the surface was smooth and still and ordinary, reflecting the room, reflecting Kara at the counter, reflecting the thing wearing her face, moving across the floor toward her. The reflection in the mirror smiled. She read the instructions. She understood they specified not to break the fast until the ritual was complete. She broke it at 3 a.m. because she had been fasting for 3 days and she was hungry, and her body drove her to the kitchen before the decision was made. This is not a failure of attention. This is biology. This is what 3 days without food does to the threshold between intention and action. The ritual was designed for this exact failure mode. It specified the end point clearly enough that any careful reader would know to hold on until 3 a.m. It created the conditions under which holding on until 3 a.m. was the hardest possible thing. 3 days of fasting, the most devastating possible image in the mirror for 8 hours. The longing fully active and fully focused. The end point and the trigger were the same moment. The window and the trap were the same mechanism. Someone built this. Someone who understood maternal longing well enough to design an instrument that fed on it. Who understood the specific quality of the grief that makes a rational solicitor sit in front of a mirror at midnight for 3 consecutive nights and whisper apologies to the air, who understood that the longing would not diminish and that the right presentation at the right moment would bring a person to exactly the point the trap required. The entity is not the child Kara lost. She knows this. She is standing at the kitchen counter knowing this, watching it cross the room toward her in her own face and calling her by the only name she has ever wanted to be called in that specific voice. It is hungry. It was born from hunger that has no end. It is calling her mother. Thank you for joining me tonight. My name is Ilara, and I am your whisperer. I'll be here, waiting for you next time. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment below. I want to hear your stories. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more. This has been Karma Quietly Whispers. See you soon.